the legal requirements that banks and financial institutions have to do hasn't gone away. They still have to do their KYC checks. And the worst possible thing that they can do is leave themselves wide open to fraud, or not even necessarily fraud, just wide open to being fined for not following the rules just because it's a crisis.
Hey and welcome to Homescreen. I'm Jim Safford and I'm a product lead here at 11FS. Homescreen is a show brought to you by the team behind 11FS Pulse. This is a show all about product, and we're mainly here to talk to you about impactful companies and the sort of stuff that they're building right now. So to find out a little bit more about Pulse, the platform that underlies this show, go to pulse.11fs.com. That's the platform to go and see how we've put that together, and then go to @11FS Pulse on Twitter. Today I'm joined by Peter Bainbridge-Clayton from Kompany, that's company with a K, and we're going to be talking about how businesses are setting themselves up to handle problems around KYC and company checking, and how they're delivering a solution for a range of different AML problems. Peter is the CTO at Kompany, so his focus is often more on the product's tech stack itself and how it supports some of the more testing challenges of this day and age, typically with those problems around movements of money and who really owns these businesses. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the real benefit of being able to check businesses, and also a little bit about what he learned from his time designing systems for Companies House, the UK's register. He was responsible there for maintaining and building quite a lot of their technical infrastructure and also their APIs. Welcome, Peter. Could you just give us a quick rundown of who you are and how you came to be involved with Kompany?
Hi, Jim. First of all, I'd like to say thanks for inviting me to this. Very enjoyable. My name is Peter Bainbridge-Clayton. I'm one of the co-founders and the CTO of actually what's called 360 Company AG. That's his full title, but it's commonly referred to as Kompany or Company with a K, just to avoid confusion. The idea for Kompany was born over a bottle of South African wine in Johannesburg back in early 2012, late 2011. And I was actually there doing a mobile telecom operator. I was helping out with the architecture there. And I bumped into my old friend Russell, who's the other co-founder. And we'd been working together off and on for many years, sort of 15 plus years then. And he just finished working at bwin, the gambling site.
Yep.
And one of the problems he had there was that people were asking to do advertising on site, but he had no real way of telling who these companies were, whether they were legitimate companies, whether they were real, because they were from all over the world. And there was no really good way of actually checking these companies out to see whether they were the sort of people you'd want associated with your company.
Sure.
Coincidentally, I'd just come back from a 6-year stint at Companies House in the UK.
Yep.
Where I actually was only supposed to be there for 6 months. However, that turned into 6 years when my role became to redesign the entire central system, so the actual register at Companies House. Right. Became the design and the implementation of that, obviously with a big group of developers, became my role. So I had all this knowledge about how corporate registers work and what corporate register data looked like. And then I bumped into my old friend, and he just said, well, we had this need to access corporate data from all over the world, and with no way of doing it because we didn't know where to go, we couldn't speak the language, etc., etc. So we figured the wine was very good, I have to say. We figured if we can connect all the registers in the world together into one place, then anybody who needs this information can come to us, and we'll just get that information for them, get the documents for them, and play it back to them. And that's essentially the genesis of Kompany.
Interesting. And so how did that initially work from a technical perspective? What were the sort of the key initial challenges that you envisaged or faced when you were going about sort of trying to combine all these different bits of registration documentation into one place?
The key challenge, and this was actually designed right into one of the basic building blocks, was that we knew all the data that we got from these different sources were going to be in different formats. We knew they were going to be potentially different data points. We knew they'd have different names for sure. And so it was important right from the start to avoid the trap of designing a database for one source or for two sources or for three sources. It had to be designed for an unknown number of sources with an unknown number of data points. And that was the key design decision that I made. And basically we used a graph structure in there. It's not a graph database because they weren't really around back in 2012. It's a relational database, but there's a graph structure built into it. Okay. And on top of that, we designed what I call an extensible ontology. So we defined how data points and entities get into this structure well in advance before we'd even connected to anything. And then the whole thing just extends itself automatically as we add new sources without any change of data structure whatsoever. And the beauty of this, of course, is that on the output side, everything's consistent. So if you're using the API, you get consistent fields in consistent data in consistent fields, and the same for the web front end. What that does mean is that all the mapping and all the business logic in terms of which source producing which data fields goes into which field in the database has to be done up front. But that's a good thing because that means we're doing that work for our clients. They don't have to do it, and we get domain knowledge increasing every single time we add a jurisdiction.
How do you go about mentally mapping out what's going to be required from a technical perspective before anything's actually happened in that regard?
Started from the very open-ended data structure, and that was the key thing. And on top of that, I placed the access and control layer to that. So what we have is we have this graph structured database in a relational database. On top of that, we have a Java layer, J2EE layer, and the sole purpose of that is actually to maintain this data cache in our graph structure. And it does that by connecting through to the registers, either directly or via intermediary nodes, and then updating this cache and maintaining that structure. And that's its primary goal. Now, the important thing there is that system so far is entirely ambivalent towards who's using it. It doesn't care. Beauty of that, of course, is that then you can overlay different front ends on it. So API front ends, different web front ends, customized front ends, and they worry about who's using them. They worry about the users. They worry about the API keys. The core, and we literally do call it the core, doesn't care about that, which is quite right. It's got no business caring about that. Its job is to do connections and do data. And it's that level of design where you have to think, okay, who's responsible for this piece of information? Who's responsible for a username? It's nothing to do with this bit, so it shouldn't have to do with it. There's always a tendency, especially with startups, to try and throw everything in at once to get something running, to get something shown to investors, to get cash to buy your next beer. And we could have done that, but it would have been absolutely a disaster because we'd have ended up in a situation where I've seen a lot of companies who tried to get into the space that every single time they do something, even as simple as adding a new US state. So it really comes about with, I must have spent 3 months designing on paper before I wrote a single line of code.
Got you. Okay, cool. So with that level of flexibility, you must have wanted to bake in a certain level of flexibility in terms of who was going to use the product as well. Did you have any sort of people in mind who would be typical first users when you were starting this sort of process of writing out on paper your design structure?
We knew that there was a need for accessing data on companies, and we knew that there was a need for accessing documents on companies. Now, interestingly, at first, we actually had the SME market in mind.
Okay.
So we thought, okay, and in sort of German-speaking countries, because we started in Austria, we had an Austrian license to access the government register there. Austria is a bit unusual in that you can't just go as a person to the government register. You have to go through an intermediary, a licensed intermediary. And we're one of those intermediaries, and that means we're licensed by the Austrian government. We're licensed to collect money on their behalf. We're allowed to do these things. And we need to meet certain technical requirements because we connect to the federal data centers. But if you're a small business owner in Austria or Germany or Switzerland, places like this, and you go to the bank for a loan, say, what they'll ask for is essentially an extract from the corporate register from you, no less than 6 months old. No more than 6 months old, obviously. And that's fine. But to get this, you have to go, say, through an intermediary, or you have to go through the German register, which sounds easy, but we're spoiled in the UK because Companies House actually makes access so simple. In these other countries, there's costs involved, you need accounts, there's all manner of hurdles to overcome. And we thought, okay, there's this big market there for small businesses needing to do these things, needing to prove themselves to their clients, needing to prove themselves to their customers, wanting to check on their suppliers, and that would be a good thing. And it's actually a big market, but it's very long tail. All the time we were thinking the other industries that need this must be big corporates who have long supply chains, because they have to do this sort of check. And people like banks, legals, particularly real estate, they must have this requirement. It just seems sort of self-evident to us that they must have this requirement because they get people coming to them all the time. And why would you, if you were a bank, say, why would you ask a client walking in the door to give you a piece of paper to prove to you that what he's saying is true? That actually makes no sense at all. You would go to the source and get it, and then you can compare what he claims with what the actual source says. And so we approached it from both angles. We figured that the SMEs were an easier market to tap into because a startup getting into the banking system is not a trivial matter by any means. And especially back in 2012, 2013, 2014, there was no really strong regulatory push for those customers to actually require our service in any meaningful way. That's changed dramatically, of course, over the last 3 or 4 years. Okay. So our focus has totally shifted from, we just still do have a long tail of SME customers, but our focus is on corporates. So large scale corporates, industrials, banking, legal, insurance, that sort of thing.
Okay, interesting. And you were saying there that one of the sort of typical problems that you might, well, I would imagine based on what you just said, one of the typical problems you might have experienced then is just the difference in the way that databases like Companies House are set up in the UK compared to their German counterparts or something like that. To what extent was, you mentioned in the intro that you were involved in Companies House for some time. To what extent was, this sort of thing born out of the thinking or any thinking that happened around that time? Was there anything you took from that experience at Companies House into this particular project?
Yeah, lots. The domain knowledge around this sort of information that these registers hold, for sure, that was one of the main things, and just the general operation of how registers work. And even if you've had your own company, it's not entirely necessarily clear what actually goes on there. How does document filing work? What happens with document processing? There may be an assumption that you send a document and it gets put on the database as text, and that's not always true. Some of it will end up on a database, and some of it just ends up as a scanned document on a disk somewhere. So data isn't necessarily what's extracted. Luckily, what we didn't do, because had we not done 2 jurisdictions at once, so we did UK and Austria in parallel, the UK is actually a bit of a spoil sport because it makes life so very easy for people like us. The API is very good, the interface is excellent, it's improved. It used to be XML and now it's a JSON interface. Whereas Austria, having an entirely different legal system and an entirely different set of interfaces and an entirely different structure around, made sure that we weren't blinded to the intricacies of these different things. And we didn't think that everything was like Companies House. Had we done that, and this is actually a lot of UK-based companies fall into this trap. So it was important from domain knowledge, for sure. From a technical perspective, it was a nice, easy, low-hanging fruit because it was so easy to do. But it didn't really help in technical terms of in connecting to other things. Where it did massively help was actually in personal terms, generating relationships with other registers and registrars and technical teams. Because I came from a background of having been in the club, if you like. So that was easy. But I think of the 120 plus, I forget exactly how many interfaces we've written, maybe 30 of them you could say were the same within reason. I've seen every manner of interface there is under the sun. And it's, and this is really the base of our USP, in that we've done all this interfacing work in advance. And it's we got very, very good at writing interfaces.
I'll bet. One of the unfair questions that we have to ask nowadays in these most sort of trying days of lockdown and whatever is that, do you envisage sort of what's going on in terms of COVID-19? You know, the provision of liquidity into different sort of small businesses via, the Treasury in the United States, for example, the different schemes available here in the UK. Do you envisage that having an impact in the way that company operates, with the way that your product operates, in any capacity?
Directly, no. It's been a very interesting time for us, because at first, like everyone, we thought, well, okay, this is going to have a serious impact, and in some cases, it actually has had an impact. You know, people maybe who are about to sign contracts are now delaying for a few months just to let the dust settle, that sort of thing. But we also realize at the same time that with these government bailouts coming, the legal requirements that banks and financial institutions have to do hasn't gone away. They still have to do their KYC checks. They still have to do their EDD and the AML checks. And the worst possible thing that they can do is leave themselves wide open to fraud, or not even necessarily fraud, just wide open to being fined for not following the rules just because it's a crisis. The regulator won't care. The rules are still there, and they're quite clear what you have to do. So we potentially have an uptick in requests to our platform because there's an uptick in requests to the banks to do all these checks. Having said all that, it's clearly not working quite as well as governments expected it to do. We know that the take-up rate, the application rate, and the actual take-up rate there's a massive disparity there. And interestingly, we formed a sort of loose coalition between ourselves and a few other companies like Shield Pay and Swoop and Railsbank to actually provide what we call an oven-ready solution to this problem. So we've got the AML side, which we can do. We've got the distribution side. We've got the monitoring of where the money has gone to and what's being done with its side as well. So we're trying to talk to people at Treasury to try and push forward this sort of loose consortium as at least an optional way of doing these things, and also to help out the high street lenders to say, well, look, you know, if you're swamped with this stuff, we can do it for you. You can delegate that authority to us, and we can handle it. And you don't have to worry about trying to rebuild your systems in 2 weeks, which is going to be awfully difficult.
That sounds interesting. Have you got any information online about that project at the minute?
There's a little bit. I can send something through from the chappie who's sort of running it, as it were. But I'll certainly send you something. Yeah,
that sounds great. Thank you. Look, that sounds really interesting. Cool. And then I guess what we'll do now is just take a look at the first journey.
This is our opening page, where essentially it's just a search page. So here are the countries that we're directly connected to electronically, the jurisdictions. We are connected to others, but there's a degree of manual work required there. Mm-hmm. So you can see now, if I just type in a word like hello, we can see these are suggestions coming up. So these are from our cache, and it's basically just going through and doing a relatively simple fuzzy text matching thing to go there. Now, if we do 360 company, as I said, this is actually our company name, so it's the top one there. And we get much fewer matches because very few people are actually called that. Now, as I said, this stuff is coming from our cache. If we click, and it's kind of like Google, where you get suggestions and you click search because, no, that's it. We have this magnifying glass. what's actually happening here, because that magnifying glass has been hit, we're searching around the globe through the 150 jurisdictions, I actually forget how many there are, in real time for that search. So this is an actual real-time global search through company registers for 360 Company as a name.
Interesting.
So yeah, that's quite a thing. If you think hitting 150 registers in parallel at once, that's quite a thing. So here's what we call a P page, a profile page. And this shows basically the information that we've received from the register for that company. Some of this, because it's ours, we've put in by hand because we can trust it.
Yeah.
For other companies where we don't know who they are, it's literally the information straight from the register.
Okay. So this is
what's happened
partially from you.
Sorry, what's happened in the background,
right?
Yeah, is that this data was refreshed in real time.
Yeah.
So it initially shows data that we have from our cache, and then you can see it says updated successfully. It actually shows data pulled from the register itself at that point in time, at that second. So this data is totally 100% fresh.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you can see it includes the filing history, so you can buy separate documents. It includes things like the announcements where they're in. So everything that someone needs to do their KYC.
In terms of sort of the end users of this product, what are they sort of expecting to see experience-wise and product-wise from this experience? What's so compelling about the notion of a really a live search component going on right there for the user?
I'll just correct one tiny thing if I could before we go on.
Sure.
The information we show is from the register always.
Always, okay.
We don't mix it with data from other sources. We don't. We actually had a thing where people could send us their information and we would put it on, and they would like own the P page. But we dropped that because we realized we can't say that this information is trustworthy because it's come from the register. Okay. On our particular page, we retain some of that, but that's because that's us. But for anyone else, what you see is what the register has. Pure and simple. So you know it's trustworthy, you know where it came from, and you know when it came from there. Sorry, so that's important. We don't
distinction.
It's a very important distinction. That's actually what makes us so different from people like CRAs. We don't aggregate data at all. We aggregate access. So, but yeah, to your point. So, how many registers have APIs? Surprisingly, very, very few.
Right.
And it's a constant source of irritation to me that so few do actually have. Registers have a very heavy focus on getting information in. They don't put as much effort into getting information out, which is actually a shame, and it's a problem because registers are part of the economic infrastructure of a country. Without them, you can't do anything because you can't trust anyone and you can't meet your requirements to do these things.
And presumably that sort of thing looks to be changing a bit more dramatically, certainly in places like Australia where they have consumer data right, that sort of thing, more far wide-reaching sort of data regulations where screen scraping is starting to become prohibited, or that sort of screen scraping activity. Potentially you'd expect to see more of these APIs becoming available over the next few years?
Sure, and they need to, I really do hope so, but there needs to be a balance, of course. When you talk about getting data out of a register, the instant thought for most people is somebody using a website to get one document that they need, and they're happy for the next 6 months or the next year.
Right.
But they aren't the actual people who need this data. They're the people who need it on occasion. The people who need this data are the big financials and the industrials who are struggling to automate these processes because the regulations have become much more burdensome on them. And the only way they can do that is through automation and robotics. But without an API, you can't do that with an API which doesn't allow you to do things at any reasonable speed, you can't do it. So there needs to be a lot more thought, and I strongly suggested to registers that you should have one person whose sole task it is to actually design, implement, and worry about the output side, and the output side should primarily be an API. it should not be a website. You should build the website on top of the API. If you did that, then everything becomes much simpler down the road.
What sort of information are these people typically looking from these records, from both the surface level and then much deeper into the actual records themselves? Is there anything consistent, any consistent themes across that, sort of what they're looking for?
It's more a question of degree. And some use cases that we have from big organizations are actually very, very simple. Literally, does this company exist or not with the name that it claims? And that's a very, very trivial use case. All they're really after is the name. They may check the address or the jurisdiction. Is there a company in the UK called ABC123 Acme Limited or not? If there is, then they're happy they can do whatever it is they do. If not, then their answer is no. And that's literally the simplest. I suppose the next step up would be, okay, give me basic information. Give me their trading status. Give me their address. Do they have a managing director? And is he the chap who stood in front of me? And they're the really, really simple, low-hanging fruit use cases, nice and simple, nice and compact. At the other end of the scale, we have document purchasing. So, okay, yeah, we're happy that this is a company where, let's say they're onboarding. We want the register extract from them, which is a particular thing in some jurisdictions. We want the last set of accounts. We want their incorporation documents because we want to see who the signatories are, for example. We want to see who the current shareholders are. That's always a big one. And then right at the very far end of the scale is the UBO, the ultimate beneficial owner question, which is becoming more important and that is simply who actually operates this company, who's benefiting from this company, who's in control of this company, and where are they? And that's the kind of the very, very deepest level that it is possible to go to. Now, you may, on top of that, do extra things which aren't necessarily related to register information. So that information we can get from register via various means. It's not always simple and it's not always direct. We have to do some very, very clever stuff. But essentially we can get there. But then there are things like, okay, we found out that John Smith is running this company from somewhere in a very hot country. That must be nice for him. What else do we know about him? Okay, but then we can overlay value-added services on top of that. So PEP, sanctions, adverse media checks. So is he, for some reason, on a sanction list? Oh, yes, he is, because he's a criminal. Oh, okay, that makes life a bit more interesting. What we don't do, of course, is we don't draw judgment on that. We're not interested in giving out credit scores unless we're just reselling them. We're not rating people. We're not don't want to be specifying anyone's GRC model, because everyone has different GRC models and we don't want their business logic in our system. We're a data supplier and we're an information supplier laid on top of that.
Got you. And we're going to take a look at the second half of this video, which talks more specifically what happens when we've actually purchased that report. Here we are, we've just sort of purchased or are going through to purchase that. So we're in the checkout page. It's all currently in euros and there's a secure payment option here. Mm-hmm. So this is now purchasing a sort of report for 360 Company. And then we've got it within what's called a bookshelf. Now, it might seem like quite a trivial matter, but can you just talk maybe a little bit about what the bookshelf is and what are we expecting to see here?
So essentially, the bookshelf is a filing cabinet of documents which have been purchased by the user, or we have a hierarchy system built in as well. So there may have been documents purchased by my superior, if you imagine. So you can have child accounts and then you can see their documents, but they can't see yours, that sort of thing.
Got you.
So what we do when you go through that purchase process, we then go away to the register in real time directly, and we actually purchase the document from them.
Yeah.
We pull it back as PDF or as data, depending on what that document is. And then we store it in your bookshelf so that you can refer to it when you come back. As you can see, this is my bookshelf, so it's full of testing stuff. But interestingly, you see there's a translate button as well. We actually have a translation service for documents, which is done by humans, and you get the actual the same format of document, but translated into English or whichever language you prefer there.
Got you. And you also have an alert section there. So presumably that speaks to the status of these as sort of there being versions of live documents. Is that right?
So yeah, that's based on the company itself.
Okay.
So what we do, we have various ways of monitoring companies for our clients. So if you purchase a document, you're automatically put on alert for it. Now, if something changes with that document, so they file another document, or they managing director changes, or they go bankrupt or something, you'll automatically get alerted by that, either by email or SMS or something.
Okay. And now you're just running a tax ID verification check here as well. Could you
Yeah, so this is just the extra services that showed PEP and sanctions screens that we have, and you can check tax numbers, NIF numbers, and check bank account structures, so IBAN structures as well.
Also noted as well there we had a section on sort of negative media as well, like as a part of the offering available. Specifically looking for that as sort of like bits of extra data to inform. Maybe you're just gathering. Where does that sort of extra material come from in this regard? Is that also stored in the register?
No, so we get the PEP sanctions and adverse media from a third-party company.
Okay.
There are various lists for these things, for the PEP and sanctions lists, and they connect to all those. The adverse media is done essentially by those guys trawling media, print media, online media, Twitter and Facebook if you want that level of noise. But we generally we default to not having social media because there's just too much nonsense in there.
Yeah.
But the print media and the online news media can be searched through those as well. Yeah.
Okay. And you wanted to, presumably these were due to add extra layers of sort of analysis that if someone can use to make an informed decision. Is that the sort of thinking there?
That's exactly it. So if you're doing an onboarding of a client, say, or you're doing an annual review of a client, you can then have that as part of your file on them, your case file on them. And it's just another thing on which people may want to base decisions. So, there's a far cry between going to Google and typing someone's name in and reading the first 3 entries, as opposed to going to the register and then having curated results from X thousand news sources throughout the globe on those entities. Because, of course, things that might happen to interesting companies won't necessarily happen in your jurisdiction. So you can't just go to one website and assume that they were there, because chances are the guys who are doing the naughty stuff aren't in the country you're interested in. They're somewhere much safer for them. So
yeah, absolutely. And that's a really key part of this as well, which is what I would understand is the key component is not just identifying what a business does, but where are the people that actually operate the business and what are they up to, which sort of nicely leads us on to this UBO journey, which we're going to take a look at. Just before we take a look at that, just to identify from your point of view, what is a UBO and what would somebody want with a UBO? Why would they want to understand what that person is?
In simplistic terms, a UBO is really a leaf on a tree of shareholder ownership. So you start from one company, you look at the shareholders, you follow shareholders of shareholders, and eventually you get to either somewhere you can't go any further because there's no data available, or you get to a person. If you get to a person, they are a UBO in the sense that they have ownership. Whether that ownership is over a certain threshold or not is actually largely irrelevant, because that threshold, although there's a guideline of 25%, a bank's GRC model may choose 10% or 5% or 90%. We allow them to actually pass that choice into us. We don't draw judgment. We just say we have crawled the ownership tree up to the point that you specified, and here are the results. And this is what we'll see shortly. there's a list of their shareholders. This is from the Austrian Register direct.
Yeah.
You can see the majority of those are actually companies. Quite a few of those companies are not in Austria. So this is where we have the cross-border issue that we'll come on to.
Okay, and now this product's currently in beta, and presumably that's because of the limited access that you have to this sort of this ability to do this sort of thing right now, right?
Yeah, so we're still very much building this. It'll be going for friendly user commercial use at the end of April.
Okay.
But essentially, so it will be live very, very shortly. But essentially what you can see is this is a list of people associated, shareholders, etc., associated with that company.
Sure.
Now, we found one company which we were able to expand. So we went from TourRadar to Initial Factor Speed Invest, and we expanded them. And you can see there's a lot more people involved with this.
Yeah. And
some more countries. So if you imagine you were trying to onboard TourRadar, or they ask for a loan or something. And I must stress at this point, this is beta, so the data isn't real. It's just pretend it's fake. Some of the names may be real, but that's purely coincidental.
Okay.
And you're basically shown that second grouping there as a document.
Uh-huh.
You're essentially then have to decide: do I spend a month on this, or do I just give up, or do I just say yes?
That's fascinating.
With this tool, all that's done for you, and you can filter, so you can show pathways between ownerships. So we see that this chappie at the bottom, it has a relationship with this chappie at the top, even though they may not even know each other. And again, that may be important to you. It may not be important to you. That depends entirely on your model. Now, that was this is me clicking the wrong button. That was literally 2 clicks, and we can see how complex that's got already.
Wow.
And these are different views that we have of the data. So it's very good.
Yes.
This is still, although this is amazing to use for visualization purposes, it's actually, if you imagine someone trying to do this manually, this is still going to be a problem. So we built an automatic thing in, which is this generate ownership tree option there. Now, what the system does then, it basically goes away and does all that crawling for you, up to specified limits, which are the things that you can enter here.
And you've set there the percentage points as those limits, right?
Precisely, yeah. So you can say any shareholder with less than 25%, I'm not interested in.
Yeah, got you.
And the system goes away and it pulls documents for you. It uses, if they're in data, then it just uses the data to carry on the crawl. And this is important why we have this network that we built. Because we built this whole system as a network of connections to registers and not as a database. We do have a database, but it's a cache of data. It's just what we use to speed up responses and do things like monitoring and checking. Because primarily it's a network. If we find that someone has a shareholder called Acme Limited in the UK, we can plug that name back into our network and find that company. And then we can get their shareholders and then just repeat that. So we repeat this process to do this crawling. And this is exactly what we've built and are finishing. We're finalizing now.
That's fascinating. In terms of the visualization component of it, that would seem like the key bit here in terms of really cutting through the noise and getting to the final sort of, the final UBO in that case. Why did you settle upon sort of that as the key way of not only visualizing this, but also, presenting that quick route through to the final person in that regard? How did that come about in that regard?
It was really on customer request. So we knew that these were coming because we keep a very close eye on the regulations. Yeah. Because we meet with the registers 3 times a year. We were actually we were the first commercial companies to be invited to join the European Commercial Registers Forum, which has now changed its name. So we were invited to the party there, and everyone was talking about these registers that were coming up about UBOs and PSCs. And our first thought was, from a technical perspective at least, oh great, bring them on, we'll connect, we'll have the data, everything will be brilliant. Yeah. However, the timelines haven't gone that way with these registers, and the access mechanisms aren't necessarily there, even if the registers are there. We have access to a couple, but the rest still just don't even exist. Yes, but the regulations haven't gone away and they haven't changed. So people still have to make a reasonable effort to find out how you want, to actually find out who is behind all these companies. And the only way of doing that is literally by following the shareholder tree. And as we had access to that shareholder data, in some cases it's not data, it's documents. So we've been building artificial intelligence, neural networks, and finite state machines to actually do this extraction. So there's a whole bunch of extra tech on the side there. But yeah, it is literally the only possible way of actually meeting the bank's requirements so that they can go to the regulators and say, yeah, look, we've done what you ask us to, please don't fine us. There's literally no other way of doing it at the moment.
Nice. So it's a really key feature for you guys in the future then, I'd imagine. One that you're pretty excited about.
Yeah, absolutely. It is one of our, we have sort of 4 pillars. One is what we call KYC Workspace, which is the web UI, essentially. The API, of course. Yep. This, UBO Discovery, so it's actually regarded as a pillar project for us, even though the interface is through one of the others. And KYC on Chain, which is our blockchain initiative on there. So yeah, it's a very, very important piece of the company going forward. Cool.
Right. Just before we finish off, then I just wanted to ask you a few questions, probably a little more high level, but in terms of your sort of what you're interested in for this year, what you think is going to be really exciting from a company perspective in 2020.
Yeah. So we're working on a lot of stuff. The UBO Discovery launch is going to be the biggest thing in the first part of the year for sure. And then even when we launched it, because the basic structure is there and the basic code is there, we still need to add extra jurisdictions in. So we need to add extra artificial intelligence for reading PDFs and extracting the data. That's going to be a serious, and we think that's going to be a game changer because, no one else can do this with official data.
Sure.
It can be done by certain people by having a bank of 400 people doing investigations, but the odds of that actually being the company you want are practically zero. So this is going to be the only automated way of doing this in the world. So we're very, very excited about that. Overlaying on top of that, our pending launch of the KYC on-chain, which is basically using blockchain. I almost said Bitcoin, but it doesn't actually matter which blockchain we use, to record interactions with us. So that if a regulator said to one of our customers, okay, prove that you did this check and prove it in a way that's one can take to a European court and prove, so seriously prove, not just show me log files, we'd allow them to do that because everything that happened has been recorded by us on a blockchain, and we're looking to expand the sphere of that to actually try and get the registers themselves and ideally even the regulators to become part of that infrastructure.
And you started off that program, kicked off publicly a part of that program at the back end of last year. Is that correct?
That's correct. So we initially wrote it on using Ethereum, and then we ported it to Hyperledger because a lot of our clients prefer the concept of a private blockchain, rightly or wrongly, but that's their preference. Mm-hmm. So we actually announced its official launch at Oracle Open World in September, I think it was, back in San Francisco. Yeah, so which is quite fun. It was nice. And then so we're going to expand that and expand its coverage and expand its usage and try and get that really going. And of course, these whole things they support each other. So the fact that you did a UBO discovery through the API has been recorded, and you have all the documentation that goes with it, and all that stuff can be backed up using hashes and timestamps and everything, so that the whole thing becomes as tight as a drum. I usually refer to it as what I call the onion of trust. Right now, there's several layers to KYC in business, and each one has a little bit of trust involved in that one party trusts the other party to be doing what it should be doing and what it claims to be doing. Our goal is to remove that trust entirely and turn that trust into truth. So it becomes a matter of fact that request was done at that point in time by that person, and the response was that. And that are really our big things, for this year.
Great, that sounds really exciting. And then the final, but probably most important question is, working particularly with financial services industry sort of businesses, like the kind of people that would be watching this show and who interact with 11FS, what sort of arms of the business would you typically expect to work with? Who would you expect to be interacting with, and how do they get in touch with company?
So typically we'd be dealing with either people involved with excuse me, onboarding or compliance. But that also in banks that would extend to loans and that sort of thing. So from a regulated industry standpoint, it's anyone who needs to be sure that the information they're dealing with in terms of corporates, in terms of businesses, meets the requirements that they have to operate under. Excuse me. For non-regulated industries such as large industrials, it's anyone with a big supply chain or anyone who regularly spends more than, say, £50,000 or euros or dollars, which isn't very much, of course, for these guys.
Sure.
But as soon as you hit that threshold, and I believe that threshold, it actually goes over a year, you have to do transactional checks, because that's still a nice way of doing money laundering and terrorism financing. So you have to do VAT checks, and you're supposed to check the company's status and that sort of thing. Because there's no regulator involved, that's much less pressing, but still, the requirements are actually still there, and that should be done. To get in touch with us, kompany.com is our entry point. That'll be the website. And on there's phone numbers, and we have legions of hungry salespeople just willing to take your call, I'm sure.
Fascinating. Well, that's been a really insightful conversation. Thank you so much, Peter.
No, thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Great. Okay, so that's it for today. Thank you for tuning in. Stop by next week, where there'll be more insights and journeys. If you want to see a little bit more of 11FS Pulse, head over to pulse.11fs.com, where you can also request a demo for that platform. You can also suggest a journey for us or a company to include on the show. If there's anyone you're really interested in seeing how they operate, then go to at 11FS Pulse, or hit us up pulse@11fs.com via email. Great, and we'll see you next week.